true to that. This will be posted on the State Climate Office's website following the webinar. Usually it takes anywhere from an hour to 24 hours to get up. So just as soon as that's available, I'll get it posted and send that link out to everyone. So you can watch it again if you want to. Today we have three speakers that we've pulled together who are climate communication experts. And so I'm just gonna quickly share their names, and then I'll hand the floor over to them to introduce themselves. So we have Deke Arndt, who's the Chief of the Climatic Science and Services Division from the National Centers for Environmental Information, located up in Asheville. We have Sarah Spiegler, who is the Coastal Resilience Specialist with North Carolina Sea Grant. She's located in Morehead City, Beaufort area. And then we have Kathy Dello, who's the State Climatologist and Director of the State Climate Office located in Raleigh. So we have three different organizations represented here, all really entrenched in communicating about climate change, doing climate change research, and then also representing kind of three different geographies of the state. So I'm just going to go left to right. So if Deke, if you'd like to spend a minute or two introducing yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Deke Arndt. I'm from the National Centers for Environmental Information up in Asheville. We're headquartered in Asheville, but we have campuses in Maryland, Mississippi, Colorado. We got folks in Massachusetts and Wisconsin, but we're headquartered here in Asheville. And the reason we're in Asheville is this is where all of the weather and climate data from around the world kind of end up in archives here. It was moved from the DC area to Asheville during the Cold War because at the time Asheville, or probably still, is not quite as high a value a target. And so we figured that a lot of vital records offices ended up kind of moving out into kind of oddball places like that. So that's kind of the weird story why we ended up in Asheville. Over the time, the institution that is now NCEI kind of became a real partner to the regional climate center and state climatologist communities, which each have their own kind of neat history. And NCEI, the institution that's now NCEI, has kind of grown up with the state climate effort along the way. So I came from a state climate office similar to the North Carolina State Climate Office. I came from the Oklahoma State Climate Office. And my background is I'm trained in meteorology, but I've been doing kind of applied in-service climatology my entire career, and helping people with drought and doing a little bit of climate science along the way. Back in Oklahoma, I worked a lot with extension folks. Actually, we had a mesonet, much like the EcoNet in North Carolina, that was a joint project of Oklahoma State University and the University of Oklahoma. So we got to work with the OSU extension folks quite a bit. And I've learned quite a bit. I have a kind of an odd background in adult education of all things. And so a lot of the communication work that I do kind of draws upon that. And we can talk about that if you'd like, but I don't want to take up a whole lot of time with a long introduction, but that's me. And I'm really looking forward to it. I'm thankful that y'all invited me to be here today. And I'm sorry that I had difficulties getting on.
Thank you. Well, we're excited to have you here. And I did not know about the adult education background, so I will definitely be asking questions on that. So next, Sarah.
Hey everyone, I'm Sarah Spiegler. And I just first want to say thank you to Kathy and Rebecca for inviting me today. I'm really excited about this topic and really excited to talk to all of you. As Rebecca said, I'm with North Carolina Sea Grant. I am our Coastal Resilience Specialist, and North Carolina Sea Grant is headquartered in Raleigh at NC State, and we also have satellite offices in the Outer Banks at the Coastal Studies Institute, in Morehead City at NC State, and then down in Wilmington at UNCW. I've been with North Carolina Sea Grant for about 2 years now. I just started as the Coastal Resilience Specialist this past summer. Before that, I was the coordinator of a program called the North Carolina Sentinel Site Cooperative, which was under North Carolina Sea Grant. And in that program, I focused on the impacts of sea level rise to coastal habitats and coastal communities in North Carolina. And before that, I was the outreach specialist for the Sentinel Site Cooperative. And I worked with the Sentinel Site Cooperative for about 4 or 5 years. So I've been talking about sea level rise and climate change for a long time now in North Carolina, and it is one of my favorite parts of my jobs to do the communication aspects. And I'm really fortunate to work for North Carolina Sea Grant because we have an awesome communication staff, and they help me make all of my work better. And I've learned so much from them. So I feel very, very fortunate to work for such an awesome organization. I have a background in coastal management and environmental management and biology. And I would say a lot of my communication background has been through formal training, but also learning on the ground and just working with lots of different people and talking to lots of different people and listening. Listening is really important. So I think I'll stop there right now.
Thanks, Sarah. I know I'm always so impressed with Sea Grant and all the work that they're doing in the coast and their communications team. All right, and then Kathy.
Yeah, I love Sea Grant too. So good morning, everybody. My name is Kathy Dello. I'm the state climatologist of North Carolina and also the director of the State Climate Office, which is co-hosting this webinar. So thank you, Rebecca and Tom, for putting together this really wonderful series. I'm so happy to be a part of this final panel. I've been on the job 18 months. It's not the first year I had planned or in mind. State climatologists like to get out and see people and talk, and there's not a whole lot of that going on right now. So we've had to be creative with some of our outreach. I moved here from Oregon, where I spent 10 years. I was the associate director of the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, which was a group that was formed by the Oregon State Legislature in 2007, basically to help state agencies plan for climate change. So I've done a lot of that work in the boundary space, talking with people, but also listening to their climate concerns. And then I like bouncing between the coasts. I'm from New York originally. I'm sorry, North Carolinians. I know we're taking over the state, but I promise that I love North Carolina a whole lot. And I worked for a state agency in New York, and in 2006, we started sea level rise planning, which was pretty novel at that time. People were still thinking about adaptation and resilience as a cop-out, that we weren't going to take climate change seriously if we said it's happening and we've got to at least plan for some of the impacts. So I've been doing this now for about 15 years. I really like this part of my job too. I love talking, as you'll find out over the next 90 minutes or however long we're here. But my background is really in climate science. My PhD is interdisciplinary. So if you ever want to have an identity crisis, do an interdisciplinary PhD because you won't really know what you are at the end of it. But I studied barriers to climate adaptation in Oregon. So trying to figure out why we kept planning and planning and planning, but never really getting to implementation. So I will stop there.
Awesome. And yeah, well, Kathy is the director for my office. So obviously I'm very thrilled to have her here today. All right, so just a little bit of logistics for today. So as I mentioned, just before I got started, it's really just a discussion today. So we'll have about 45 to 60 or so minutes of discussion, and I'm just going to kind of keep track of how the conversation is going. If we get a lull, then that's when we'll take a 5-minute break. And then we'll come back and we'll continue the discussion. This is really, we want it to be a chance to bring your questions. If you're here today in the audience, what are the things that you're curious about when it comes to talking about climate change? What are those lessons learned that you would like some insights on? From the pre-webinar survey, I know a lot of you helped fill that out, and we collected those, some of the questions you submitted, and we pulled those together into some prompts for our speakers. During the webinar, if you would like to ask a question, we really want this to be as interactive as we can make it over Zoom. So you can type your question into the chat. We also came up, I give this credit to Tom, the idea to just type an exclamation point if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question directly to the speakers. We sort of welcoming that this week. Finally, I guess I'll just say that I'll be moderating and Tom will also be moderating, Tom from NCICS, who's been helping me plan these webinars. think, am I forgetting anything in terms of logistics? I won't be addressing questions to a specific speaker. I'll just kind of throw it out there and then let the either Kathy, Sarah, or Deke answer. And we're hoping that you guys might bounce off a little bit. So we'll just kind of keep track of it. We really want this to be more of a discussion. All right, so with that, with it being a webinar about talking about climate change, I wanted to start with a question which kind of gets at the why should we talk about climate change? Why is it important to you that we talk about this? And when you're talking about climate change, what is it that you're hoping to achieve?
I'll jump in there. So when I talk about climate change, I'm usually, because I work currently in the more kind of physical climate side, kind of the analysis, what's happening, how fast, where is it happening, what seasons are being affected, that kind of stuff. Typically, when I'm dealing with people on climate change, it's to reach a fundamental understanding of what's going on in the world, and then the kind of obvious next step is how does that affect me? Me being whoever I'm working with, and that involves kind of boiling down on what do you really value? How related are you to the climate? We're always way more dependent and related to the climate than we appreciate. Even those of us who go around preaching how connected we are to the climate learn almost, I'm freezing up here, but I'm in a, seasons matter. I'm in an unheated room above my garage. It's really cold, so seasonal cycles are a big part of life, so one of the cool things I've learned here, and I think we'll dive into this, is just like how orchard crops work. And I would have never guessed that peaches and apples needed so many cold hours over the cold season. And you don't get there unless like Sarah said, you listen. And I come from a flat place with not many trees, and I learn a lot about the ag and the hort stuff that goes on in North Carolina, and that's typically the space that I'm working in, and try to go where the conversation leads us. The most important thing you do in a conversation is listen, and that's an important piece, especially in climate change, when people can come into that conversation with a lot of preconceived notions about what their take is and what your take's gonna be.
I will jump in. So I believe this to be the most important issue of my generation. And often climate scientists will try to separate themselves from kind of the issue at hand. But I love my job, but I don't necessarily do this job because it's a job. I do this job because I think it's important. And I think talking about climate change is important. And I think that helping people understand their risk and what's at stake in a warming climate is super important. It really, truly is my life's work. But I'm also very selfish. I love the outdoors. I love camping. I love hiking. I love riding my bike. And I want all of those places to be pristine and accessible and not on fire and not flooding. So, it's altruistic at some level, but also for me, this is a planet that I love and I want it to be here for the next, generations and generations to come. I want them to have the same experiences that I did.
Kathy, I could have given the exact same answer that you just did. I agree. I love being outdoors. So part of it is very personal. I love North Carolina, and I love coastal North Carolina, and I'm already seeing changes here. I've lived here about 10 years and I see the changes that have happened in the past 10 years. But to build on what Kathy said, so my job is as coastal resilience specialist to help communities become more resilient, to help our natural resources become more resilient. And like Kathy said, the biggest threat that we're facing in our generation is climate change. And so I was not really around when Kathy was talking about how previously, if you talked about adaptation, people thought that was a cop-out and that you weren't trying hard enough to stop climate change. Well, in my career, I haven't really faced that attitude. We are talking about adaptation and how are we going to face the challenges and the changes that we're seeing on the ground in our communities. And if we don't take action, we're going to have communities and ecosystems that are probably not supporting the lifestyles that we want. And so in my job, as we're thinking about how do we make our communities more resilient, how do we make our ecosystems more resilient, I think if you don't have the correct message, if you don't have a consistent message, if you're not sure what you're asking people to do, you're not going to get to that bottom line of making your communities more resilient. And so at the end of the day, I think communication is one of the most important things that we can do, effective communication, and making our communities more resilient. It's sort of like if you're in a relationship, if you can't communicate with your partner, no matter how much you guys like each other, it might not work. And I really think that communication is key in the climate adaptation field.
Great, thanks, Sarah. And that's probably a good transition to our next topic. Some of the responses we've seen in the chat, the question about humans to blame, that argument can be difficult. It depends on who you're talking to. Someone mentioned that homeowners are less receptive to ideas about climate change than commercial growers. So one of our pre-seminar questions was, how do you deal with tough audiences? And I think you've already talked a little bit about sort of listening to your audience, but what are your strategies for addressing an audience you know that might be a little resistant? Do you change your terminology or do you change your approach? So any thoughts on that?
I guess I'll jump in because I have perspective from two states that are very different but very similar in many ways. And when I worked in Oregon, I worked all over the state. And you may have ideas of what you think Oregon is like, but it's a very diverse state. And I worked with farmers and ranchers in Eastern Oregon, and they were one of my favorite groups to work with because I built such a strong relationship with them. And it was years of showing up to meetings and having conversations. And we got to the point where they said, we like Kathy, we trust her, let's listen to her message. So, not all farmers and ranchers are, tough to talk to about climate change, but I understood that I couldn't just barge into a community that I wasn't a part of that may not be immediately receptive to the message, and that I really just needed to build relationships first. It takes a lot of time, but it's incredibly rewarding, and it's some of the most favorite work that I've done. But I also like to look at Yale's climate communication survey, Global Warming 6 Americas, and you can see that the population as a whole generally accepts that climate change is happening. There's a part in the middle that, might have some questions, but, they're fair questions. And then there's about 10% that are called dismissives. They're never going to change their mind. They have other motivations at hand. They're not thinking about science. And I don't bother with those people anymore, to be quite honest, because they're usually acting in bad faith. But that other 90%, I tend to think they're coming to the conversation in good faith. And I want to have those conversations with that 90%.
I can jump in next. So I'm going to give a specific example. So I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, I was asked to speak at a local Rotary Club monthly meeting. So if anyone's part of Rotary Club, I think it's very common. They have these luncheons and then they invite a speaker. And I was invited by the town's assistant town manager to talk about what I do in my job. And at the time, my job was all about sea level rise. And so as we all know, it's really important to know your audience, who you're talking about. And yes, I think it's important to change some of your vocabulary depending on who you're speaking to. You don't want to use jargon and big words for an audience that's not going to understand that. It's just going to make them tune out. And so I understood that about this audience. It's their lunchtime. They don't want to hear lots of technical terms. They're at a certain level. They're not scientists, but they're also, educated. And so I knew all that, and I prepared a PowerPoint and I walked into the lunch meeting and I looked around at the audience and I immediately thought, what I've prepared is not the correct thing. If I say what I'm going to say, even though I thought I brought my level down, it's going to go over their head and they're just going to ignore me. So I spent about 10 minutes before my talk, like scribbling furiously notes about, okay, how do I reframe what I was going to say to what the audience is in front of me? And what I basically did was I thought about all of the reasons why I loved living locally in that area, because it was close to my home. And I thought about all the impacts that we were seeing, you know, flooding, higher water levels, those kind of things. And this was about 5 years ago. And I specifically I don't think I used the words climate change in that talk. Maybe once or twice, but not a lot. And I focused on the impacts to the community that I was speaking to. And it went over awesome. People asked tons of questions at the end. They were very engaged. They paid attention the whole time and they were really interested in what I was doing. But I did think, as I was talking, very carefully about the words I was using. I used words such as coastal flooding, coastal inundation, instead of sea level rise, instead of climate change. And while I don't think you should shy away from the scientific terms, sometimes it is useful to maybe use them less frequently or to focus more heavily on the impacts. And that was 5 years ago, and I do think times have changed somewhat, but you know, that's sort of a lesson in know your audience. I think I'll end there.
So I can't improve those. I totally agree. The one thing that helps, I think, and Kathy kind of alluded to this, you know, there are 10% or so of folks, whether through their outlook on the world or even maybe, you know, throw a few more percent on personality where it's just, you know, not the right venue. You know, a conversation is just not going to succeed. And you usually know when those are going to happen. When you are working with that 90% that Kathy mentioned, you know, it helps to be humble and helps to focus on issues and problems. And, you know, I worked a lot with ag. So cattle and wheat, winter wheat were big in Oklahoma. And, you know, if I came in, just like Kathy and Sarah both alluded, if I came in with a briefcase full of $10 words, it wasn't going anywhere. And, but, you know, it's what we would talk about. And if we led with climate and I showed a trace of the global temperature on a screen, that's not going to help. No one's crops wilt because of the global temperature. But what you can do is talk about problems. You know, are you finding you have to spray a little earlier in the year or more often, or there's more fun, you know, you're using more fungicide, and well, that might be because the humidity's you know, kind of up in the upper ranges a lot more, or that might be because the winters are shorter. And once you start talking about the cost of this stuff, and you know better than anyone that in every grower's brain, you know, half of that is dedicated to this amazing complex process of risk management. And once you can tap into that piece of their brain, and they're thinking about costs and expenses and timing and schedule, that's where I think the chance to really do some good and really help find that piece of climate change that's important to them. And you may get a beautiful conversion story where someone sees the world differently and they go home and they wipe tears from their eyes. That's usually not going to happen. But what you do sometimes come up with is someone that's more equipped and better understands what's going on in the climate system and how that affects them.
So sort of a follow-up to those is thinking about, you know, like the know your audience, right? Sarah, you mentioned that, and then Deke, you know, you don't want to just throw up a global temperature trend line. And so when I've given talks, I've sort of struggled with how much kind of general global climate change science do you try to impart, you know, sort of that, or do you just jump right into the localized impacts? And then kind of the dovetailing with that is that, do you have tips for like quickly identifying the knowledge level that your audience is at, so that you can make sure that you're adjusting, and knowing that the answer to that question may be completely different in person versus in the world that we live in now.
So I've had Sarah's experience many times. You show up, you're like, I brought the wrong set of materials and equipment. It happens a lot. And the good thing is, in the work that y'all do, you generally do know kind of what's going on with the folks that you're going to talk to, and as so you're way more kind of invested and aware in what are the issues, and they're going to revolve again around a lot of that risk management. I do a lot less we kind of divide climate response into two areas, and Kathy alluded to this. Adaptation, how do we deal with the climate change we know is happening, we know it's coming, and how do we just better deal with it? And mitigation, how do we slow that down? How do we slow down climate change in general? So I don't do nearly as much work with kind of problem focused growers and hort folks in the energy industry and that was all kind of adaptation work. Nowadays, I talk a lot with communities of faith, actually, and they're way more interested in kind of solving the bigger problem. They think very much about kind of their relationship with people around the world and generations to come, and these bigger, complex, kind of unsolvable, seemingly, problems are very much in their wheelhouse. And so when I go into a house of faith and we're working with folks on those issues, I know that I'm going to be talking a lot more about big picture climate change and impacts around the world and what it means and how this piece of the climate system is connected with that. But when I was working with the Cattlemen's Association in Blaine County, Oklahoma, we were talking about warmer winters and prairie fire, and not really getting into the big piece. And I don't know if I have any insights other than kind of listening, know your audience, and be prepared for the surprisingly high percentage of time when you came equipped with this, but they really wanted that. And that would be my advice: is have more tucked away in your back pocket, maybe, and be ready to shift gears when you can.
Yeah, I'm a state climatologist, not a globe climatologist. I almost never talk about the globe as a whole unless it's setting a big record. We know that 2020 might set a global temperature record this year. I think that's important context. But like Deke said, farmers aren't looking at a global temperature graph to think about their crops. For me, this is very local and, like I said, very personal. So I jump right to North Carolina, right to some of the impacts in our regions. Scientists like to build up, the body of knowledge that they have to prove that they're the experts. So we know the globe is warming. Now we know the US is warming. We know North Carolina is warming. I start right with North Carolina. And Deke gave, a number of good strategies, and I'm going to offer an off the wall one, but it really does work. If you're funny, be funny. This is really dark content. This is really hard for people to grasp. And often they're coming to you over their lunch, like Sarah said, or in their free time. And truly, there's so much going on in the world right now. And it's a great way to kind of test your audience and know what you're working with. You can break the ice. You'll reduce a lot of the tension in the room. If you're not funny, don't try, and you'll know. But, truly, I have found that humor is just a great strategy sometimes in testing out my audience, but also making both of us feel a little bit more comfortable, because we're not going to solve this on our own, or as the group of 50 here, or as the state of North Carolina. We're all in this together. And sometimes you really just have to choose those moments of levity.
I'll add one thing. So I took a risk communication class earlier this year, and one of the first things they made us do was to take a quiz. What is your worldview? And so thinking about what you were talking about, the farmers versus the, church culture. So I think we all know people think differently about the world, but for me to sit down and think about what my values were and what my worldview was, and then to see what other worldviews people often hold, just made me step back and think even more about how do you communicate with people that are similar to you and people that have different values than you. And it's probably something we've all been thinking about, the past year with our political climate, because I think it can get really frustrating. Why won't people just think the same way that I do? Why do people not value the same things that I do? But when you step back and think about it, just because people are different than you or hold different values from you, that's not wrong. It's just different. And, I have to step back all the time and remind myself of that. But it's really important when you're communicating to try to think about where are people coming from. And, if they have a worldview that is more individual focused, they want to know more about how this impacts them or why it's important to them, use that, communicate climate change in that way. Or if people, like Kathy just said, are really on board with, we all need to work together, we need to solve this problem together, bring those parts of the climate change communication to the table. I think that's why this is so interesting, because people are so different, and some strategy that works for one group is likely not going to work for another group. And you really have to, be very flexible and forward thinking and continue to learn in this field about what works and what doesn't. And sometimes that changes, year to year. You'll go to a climate change communication class and they'll say, well, we've actually decided this is not quite as effective as we used to think it was. Like, for example, I've recently heard that storytelling, while it's often used in climate change communication and it can have value, sometimes is not as effective because it's just one individual person's story, and there can be downsides to that too. So, really thinking about being flexible and adaptable in your communication strategy is important too.
I'm going to take on that advice about worldview, because I struggle with why people don't share my worldview. So it's a good advice.
Yes.
I was going to ask another question, but the storytelling thing is something we talked about in our pre-meeting for this. And I know it's something that Deke is real fond of and very good at. And so maybe Deke and Kathy, if you want to talk about your experiences with using storytelling, do you have sort of an evidence base of their effective approaches, or what do you find valuable about those?
So yeah, I'll try to convey that through a story. So I promise I'm going somewhere. So and Sarah's right. Storytelling for the sake of storytelling is often kind of counterproductive. So storytelling with a point is good. And the good news is you don't have to be a good storyteller or have great stories. The nice thing about it is if your story's on, there's basically just a few elements to a story, and it's, there's a main character. It's usually a person. Sometimes it can be you. They have a problem, and they deal with that problem. They either overcome it or they don't. And there's some change that happens in the process. End of story. That's what a story is. You can tell really crummy stories. I went to the restaurant, I couldn't find a table, but then the waiter helped me. That's a story. Yeah, okay, everybody remembers that. The good thing about it is if you're confident with your stories, and try this the next time you're working with more than a few people, is if you lean into a story and say, hey, I've got a story that really kind of helps kind of lay this out. You will physically witness half of the people in your presence shift their posture to receive that story, because we've been doing this for ages. This is how we've taught each other stuff for hundreds of generations. And so we're all wired. We know what happens when someone says once upon a time. Right, we know that means, oh, I'm about to learn something here. I'm about to get a lesson. It's a sermon or a homily or a story or whatever, and that's and let me share where I learned from. And I promise this will be my longest stretch of the day, Rebecca. And you can yank me when you want me to shut up. So, but I'll tell you my story about learning about story. I was a young person working in the Oklahoma State Climate Office. I was 30 years old, and was used to being the smart person in every conversation. I had all the numbers, right? You know, and all the facts and figures. And people would come to our office and we'd help them, and that was nice. And well, then my wife was pregnant. She goes into premature labor like 11 weeks early. She's in the hospital in the ICU over here. My brand new, very premature kids in the hospital, in this other part of the hospital, in the NICU. And I'm standing there literally looking at this tiny thing with all these wires and tubes and stuff going off. And I'm standing there and all these lights and sirens go off. And I promise I'm going somewhere with this. I don't know what happened, but lights and sirens went off. A bunch of people kind of came to his isolette, which is a crib in the NICU, and the sirens went off. And so I'm standing there. I'm standing next to a nurse in front of this isolette with a tiny baby in it, across from a doctor. And she was the most important, smartest person in the room, right? And so all I knew was something bad almost happened, and they did something to fix it. And so I asked, you know, what just happened? What was all that? You know, I'm confused. And the doctor said back to me, and I knew she knew all of her stuff, right? She's easily the smartest person in the room. And she said, your son has pronounced apnea of prematurity requiring agitation. And I said, quote, what the hell does that mean? And the nurse standing next to me said, hey, it's okay. His nervous system hadn't developed. He forgets to breathe. So you just got to rub his foot, stroke his head, whatever. And it was life-changing. So that moment, so she, first of all, literally taught me how to save someone's life. And, you know, I like saved his life 100 times in the following 2 weeks, which was cool. But the other thing was, the thing that I reflected on in that moment that kind of made me reflect on my own career as a communicator was that doctor did her job, which isn't to really worry about my feelings. Her job is to fix the issue at hand. But she spoke at me in Latin, and I had no clue what she was talking about. And I thought I was a smart dude. What the nurse did was she was literally facing the situation side by side, viewing the problem from my point of view, and kind of put that translated into English, and equipped me with a way to make things better. And that was an amazing experience. And I bring that with me every time I talk to anyone about climate change. Put yourself in the position of your listener, do it in English, and when you can, provide practical tips. And that's my one story. Rebecca, I promise to go short and Tom for the rest of the day. So.
That was a great story.
And he's 6'8" now, by the way. And he weighs about 5 million pounds, and we feed him with a shovel. So, yeah.
I truly can't follow up on that. So we'll leave it there.
But that was how story can work, right? That's a pretty good story. It's not a great story. But it's a story, and we all kind of, we put ourselves in a position. So if you can shoot, you know, like Kathy, totally right. If you're funny, be funny. If you can shoot the bull, if you're a pretty good conversationalist, then you're a good storyteller. And the trick is figuring out which of your stories apply to the issues.
I think that's good. I think that you know, sort of what I'm taking from this is you know, be authentic to yourself too, right? Know who you are as a communicator and do that well. Don't try to be somebody else. I'm not a great storyteller, and I'm not very funny, but I think I have other things I can do. So we did get a question in the chat from Diana to the panelists. And so it's, do any of you make suggestions for what people can do? You know, and then what are those suggestions and how are they received?
Yeah, so Rebecca, I will tell you, my mentor sat me down truly on my first day at work in Oregon and said, the best thing you can do is be authentic. So truly, you know, audiences can spot a phony pretty easily. So as long as you're true to yourself, you're golden. What do I tell people to do? Everybody asks, what can I do about climate change? I do remind them that they're not going to solve this on their own, that we are up against a big disinformation campaign that is well funded, and even better communication isn't going to necessarily solve that. But there are things you can do. You can vote. That's probably the most important thing you can do. You can be active in your local community, planning boards, thinking about alternative transportation. That's really important when thinking about climate policy. And I'm a state policy geek in some ways. This is where we really see change happen, is in our communities and at the state level. No offense to my federal colleague, but the federal government is notoriously not nimble and slow, but states can make things move. And you'll see community plans roll up into state plans, and a lot of that's happening here in North Carolina. So just get involved, talk to your neighbors. A lot of us talk about climate change every day because this is what we work on, but a lot of people aren't talking about it at all. So have those tough dinner time conversations, stand 6 feet apart from your next door neighbor and just shoot the breeze with them and tell them why you think understanding climate change is important and why whatever approach to solving climate change that you prefer is important.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. So 2 things. First of all, like Kathy said, volunteering in your community. I think something that we can all do. I know I don't have a lot of extra time, so it's hard to ask somebody else to do these things, but volunteer for your local planning board, volunteer to be, get on your board of commissioners. I live in Eastern North Carolina in Beaufort, and I've seen a lot of changes here just in the 10 years. I've seen a lot of land use changes. I've seen maritime forests cut down in my backyard. I do my best to go to those planning board meetings, to talk to my community members. And if we have more people that can step up and do that kind of thing and talk about what they're seeing and talk about how it impacts their communities, I think that is, like Kathy said, on the local level, that's really important. There was one more thing I was going to say, and now it has totally slipped my brain. I'm sure it'll come to me later.
Well, definitely chime in whenever it comes back. And I think those are great points, right? My impression is that a lot of times if you're there representing a organization or a scientist, that you, like kind of Kathy, you had mentioned earlier, that you might want to separate yourself out, and maybe think that it's not really your role to say, do this. And so I think, walking that line between advocating for a very specific action or point of view versus giving people the tools that they need to do something and be effective is very valuable.
This kind of drives me wild, though, going back to, doctors in hospitals. If my doctor walked in and was like, this is what's wrong with you, but I'm not going to really tell you how to fix it, I would be irate. And I don't understand why climate scientists do the same thing. And you obviously know me. I would like us to not shy away from offering people our perspectives. And I know there are lines, and I know not everybody's going to agree with that. And that's one of the wonderful things about people. We don't all have to agree on everything.
Deke, did you want to comment on how you talk about people looking for solutions?
Yeah, and I think that, and again, kind of working, when you work with people in that adaptation space, it's not that the solutions are obvious in a lot of cases, but you're really working towards solutions. You're really towards working on how to get the best possible outcome for the community that you're working with. Whether that's a new strategy, new crop selection, new management practices, all of the things that you deal with in adaptation. So, it's usually, although the solution may be difficult to figure out, you know that you're together driving towards a solution. In the mitigation world, in the what do we do about climate change, in the big picture, I think one of the barometers, and Kathy mentioned how she really kind of learns pretty quickly kind of where a person is on that scale of completely incorrigible to all in, from day one. It's like a football field. On one goal line there's incorrigible, and on the other goal line there's save the world, I'm all in. And most of the people are somewhere on the football field in between, right? When you're dealing with mitigation, I think the thing that a good test is if people think or have the capacity to have the time and the disposition to understand that the things that they're going to do are going to affect people down the road, and that their chance to make a lasting difference in the lives of others that are still yet to come. If they're open to that, then I think then you have an amazing chance to get in there and talk big picture, and to talk about not just adapting to the problems that climate change brings locally, but also to try to help fix the problem that it brings globally. And I think that's a nice little litmus test. If in the course of the conversation it comes out, I want this place to be better for my kids. I want this farm to work for my grandkids. I want my granddaughter or grandson to work this farm. Then you're in, and you can start talking about those bigger pictures. And I mentioned that houses of faith tend to think about generations down the road, but family farms sure as heck do too. And they really want to see that land working for their descendants, in almost every case. And I think that's a connection, that legacy and that responsibility to future generations. If that pilot light is on, then you're in, and you can work that.
Thanks, I like that a lot. We had a question from Mark directed sort of directly at Sarah, but I think it probably is relevant for all of you. But we'll start with Sarah. As a ground zero responder with Sea Grant, have you, over your time there, do you see a heightened sense of urgency? Have you seen kind of a change in attitudes about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Mark. I will say, and this is sort of anecdotal personal experience, but I've heard other people say it too. I do think I've seen a change doing this work, over the past 8 years. I do think there's more urgency. I think a lot of that in North Carolina has to do with the two hurricanes we just had, Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Dorian. I think people saw the impacts of those. They saw the impacts of the other hurricanes we've had around, the world in the past 3 to 4 years. They are seeing more flooding in the streets. They're seeing sunny day flooding. They're seeing higher water levels more frequently. So they're seeing changes in their backyard. And I think, when I started doing this work 8 years ago, nobody cared about what I did. My family didn't really care about sea level rise. Now everybody wants to talk to me about sea level rise, coastal resilience. They put my news release for my new coastal resilience position in the local newspaper here when I started this summer, which I was shocked about. I think they think I'm going to solve all of the problems for Eastern North Carolina. So, which I said, I'm just one person. I can't solve everything. So I do think there is an urgency right now. However, we all know that people have short memories. And I wonder if this is another cycle of people paying attention. I know Hurricane Floyd was a really big event in North Carolina, and people started paying attention. Well, then that hurricane, it's been, 4 or 5 years, and people start forgetting. So that's, I think, a great question. Is this a new normal, or are people going to start forgetting again? I will say, though, on the state level in North Carolina, I definitely think there is new urgency. So many of you are probably aware that Governor Cooper issued Executive Order 80 in the fall of 2018, which is North Carolina's commitment to address climate change and transition to a clean energy economy. And so there have been many stakeholders, organizations, agencies at the state level, nonprofits, academia, federal employees that have been working on this Executive Order 80 now for, I guess that's going on 2 years. And so I do think there is an increased sense of urgency at the state level where we are recognizing that we have to work together and we have to do something. And that that is still continuing now. The implementation of that is ongoing. It is not perfect by any means. I will say that because I've worked with many of the stakeholder groups that is working on implementing Executive Order 80, but there is a sense in the state that we need to address this and we need to do it now. So I think that's a positive thing for the state. I think we're going to see at the federal level increased attention at climate change. We're already seeing that with the new administration coming on. So I think it'll be great to see what happens over the next few years.
Yeah, I always say that at the beginning of my career, we got the luxury of calling this a future problem. It's a now problem. Every week this summer, it felt like you could point to a different part of the country and see some climate disaster unfolding. And for me in particular, the Oregon fires were very, very difficult. I still get choked up when talking about them, seeing places that are very special to me, getting choked up right now, on fire. And work that I had been doing for the past 10 years to say, this is going to happen, and watching it happen was very, very tough. But there's an absolutely increased sense of urgency. So I took this job in part because I knew North Carolina was a special place. I knew that people felt an attachment to the state and to the land. And I also knew that good things were happening. I knew that North Carolina was going to try to address the climate problem, and I wanted to be a part of it. So in 18 months, we've had an annual temperature record. We're on pace for an annual precipitation record. We're ahead of 2018, even without a big hurricane like Florence. We're in the top 5, or we're in the top 3 for January through November for temperature. So, maybe another annual temperature record just in my 18 months. So we can just point to things in North Carolina and say climate change is here. And the number of hate mails I've gotten has gone down significantly. So either people are sick of me, a lot nicer here, or truly know that this is a problem.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Kathy. Same here. The amount of kind of, and the temperature of the discourse has really come down in the last 3 or 4 years, and I think noticeably, and I think that's a good sign.
This is such a great conversation, and I don't want to stop it, but I'm going to promise my 5-minute break right here. And so we'll come back at 11:02. If you don't need a break, you can type in the chat just what's resonating with you about today's discussion so far. But we will pause discussion so that you're not missing anything if you step away from your computer. Is that the obligatory truck going by your house, Kathy?
Yeah, but we haven't had the train, so we're really lucking out.
All right, well, it's 11:02, so we'll come back and jump right back in. Thank you everyone who's been submitting things through the chat as well. I'm liking the conversation that's going on there, and I'm trying to make sure that we incorporate that into questions. So the next question that we had, sort of coming in from some of the things that came in the pre-webinar survey, as well as some of the discussion earlier on, some points made by Diana and Donna. So how do you approach talking about uncertainty? Specifically, things like less detail at the state level, you don't get that nice fine-tuned geographic detail, or just thinking about uncertainty in terms of time. How do you, it's hard for folks to think about what happens 50 years or 100 years from now. There's a lot of uncertainty with that too.
That's a great question. And as someone that kind of deals with the global kind of uncertainty around different variables and measurements, it is not easy. And a lot of people do get wrapped up and they confuse uncertainty with unusable. And the reality is this uncertainty is shaped like a bell curve in almost everything, if it's a measurement, or if it's a temperature index, or if it's a time, uncertainty is kind of expressed as this plus or minus type value. And a lot of people assume that means it could be anywhere in the middle, kind of equal chances. It's like a bowling alley lane with bumper guards, and the real answer could just be anywhere on that lane. When the reality is it's a shape. And the estimate, whether it's a time or a measurement or an index value, the central value is the most likely exit, and it gets more and more unlikely as you get out closer to those uncertainty bounds. It's not a flat chance. So if the index for something is 8 plus or minus 1, that doesn't mean anywhere between 7 and 9 equally likely. It means the most likely value is 8. There's a small chance it could be 9. There's a small chance it could be 7. And I think in ag though, because people are risk managers, they love to, they do the math in their head. There's the calculus that goes on in the brain of a farmer is amazing. But they do want these uncertainty bounds in their mind. But I think as a science communicator, someone representing the science findings, that it's important to remind folks that those uncertainty bounds, that central value is there for a reason. There's a calculation, and that's the best estimate that we have right now, and that means a lot.
I love that. And I'm just going to add on that physics is easy, you guys. It's a series of laws and equations that do not change no matter how much we want them to. So we know how the atmosphere and ocean should operate together kind of in a perfect world. The really tough thing is the people part of this. How we behave, how you behave, how 7.5 billion behave and make decisions. And if you think about any argument you've had with somebody and you scream at them, I don't know what you're thinking. Well, we have to try to figure out what 7.5 billion people are thinking. Really, really hard. So we bin them into scenarios, but I like to approach it that we can change our trajectory by our actions. So that's why the range exists. And my dad's an engineer. I can pick on engineers, but engineers want one number. They want a number 65 years from now, and they want to build to that. But really, you kind of have to back into the conversation. I'm giving you this range because we really don't know how 7.5 billion people are going to respond. Our models are a tool. They're not perfect. They're not a crystal ball. And the planet still throws us some curveballs. It keeps certainly my job interesting. And I try to not use the word uncertainty at all. It makes you sound like you're just unsure when really you're just saying there's a range of future possibilities.
Yeah, I will second what Kathy said. Again, go back to know your audience, but I try not to use the word uncertainty, depending on who your audience is. So you know, if you're talking to a local school group or a community group or, you know, the general public, I think, like Kathy said, uncertainty is just confusing. I like to go back to what are the impacts, you know, more flooding, more storms, more rain, more intense hurricanes, and stay away from the uncertainty factor if you can. Now, of course, if you're, you know, working with people who are planning infrastructure projects for the future, they might need to know what the uncertainty is. So, you know, but then I would deal with that saying, you know, if you can handle more risk, then you can build more proactively. But, you know, if you are building, let's say, a hospital, you might want to accept you can't handle as much risk. And so then in that case, maybe the uncertainty is more important for you. But yes, in general, I would try to frame the conversation in a different way.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really good point on, yeah, the word itself, uncertainty, can be problematic in the English language. So thank you for those perspectives. We do have somebody who wants to ask a question. So Carl, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I decided not to type it in because I didn't really know how to be that concise. Thank you, everyone. Really interesting conversation so far. I have like 1,000 questions, and I was actually going to ask a different one, but the thing that you just said, Kathy, made me want to ask a different one. I work quite a bit in climate communication in my own research, and I've been thinking a lot recently about the how we actually define communication itself, and we often treat it as a sort of way of conveying information in a more clear and intuitive way. But I recently began to think more that communication really is a two-way process, and it's not just about climate scientists or climate communicators finding better ways to make people understand the information. You know, should there be a greater emphasis on what we should actually be listening out for? And so I kind of want to ask you what your thoughts on that are, and what we should be listening for, but being clear that I don't mean listening to what matters to people so that we can convey our message better. Yeah, I don't mean like how can I dress the message that I already have in a way that they are going to understand better. I mean, should there be more space for the public or different publics' perspectives in the conversations at the high level, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I'll start. Hi, Carl. It's good to see you. Everyone,
Kathy.
we're trying to get Carl to North Carolina to do some work, so fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you for that question. Absolutely, we need to be doing more listening, and we're seeing this right now with COVID for sure. And there are a lot of parallels. We could spend another 90 minutes on COVID and climate, but you know, Deke said something earlier, and I've said this before, you know, not everyone, but when you're the scientist, you know, you're the smart person in the room. I've come to realize I'm rarely the smartest person in the room. You know, I know my physics and I just told you it was easy. You know, that's what I've got on my side. But I'm working with people who are managing hugely complex systems that I will never truly understand. And one of the questions I just like to ask is, what keeps you up at night with this system? It doesn't even have to be climate. What are you worried about breaking? And sometimes you can, you know, find the connection there and tailor your message. And, you know, I've found that to be a really effective strategy, especially when working with some of those engineers who want that number, trying to figure out, you know, truly what they really want. And yeah, you know, we're told to be better communicators, but I also sit in a lot of meetings with a lot of other scientists, and the climate scientists are often knocking it out of the park because it's been so ingrained in us that we're horrible communicators. So we all went out and got a bunch of training, and better communication kind of isn't necessarily what we need. You know, we need much more dialogue, much more relationship building. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, I love the question, the way you framed it. I love to remind myself all the time that the the root word of communication is communion, which means coming together. It's not about articulately conveying information or crafting a message, and it is about coming together. Communion means to come together. So communication is a means to that end, and I love the way you framed it. Totally.
Yes, that was a really, really great point, that communication needs to be a two-way street. Sometimes I even think of it like in a circle, like, and all the arrows go different ways, because if you are not listening to other people, you're definitely not communicating. And I'll also add to the point, so, you know, as an extension specialist, and I think a lot of you on this webinar do extension work. So, you know, we are taught that we are providing the science, that we are the honest brokers of information. And that's really, really important, that we provide that information, and that we also learn what sort of information people need. So we're not providing science that they don't need. But then on top of that, and I think about this all the time, even if you are perfect at providing that science and that information, that's still not going to tell the community the decisions they should make. Because at the end of the day, it's really a value judgment. What kind of communities do we want? We know we might have all the science, or we might only have some of the science, but we're going to have to work together to decide how to make those value decisions. And so that definitely will require listening to other people and learning how to communicate in a two-way method. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, great question and great answers. Kathy mentioned that climate scientists in particular have gotten a lot of training recently, and there's been a lot of research in how do you shape these messages and how do you frame these messages. And a common theme that I think we've all kind of learned is, well, you shouldn't scare people, and we need to give them some sense of agency, some hope that they can alter the future. My own personal feeling on that is it really depends on who you're talking to. Some people are open to what I might tell them about climate change and are probably not scared enough. And then other people, young people especially, may be kind of overcome with despair and are like, I need to give them some hope. What are your feelings about, is it appropriate to scare people if you're in the right audience, or should you never do that? Do you try to bring in hope, avenues of making change personally or on a global scale? How do you deal with those kind of dichotomies?
We've talked about this a little bit. I don't think people are scared enough. And, watching people drown or burn alive due to climate fuel disasters is really, really tough for me. And kind of some of the blasé attitudes about, oh, we'll fix it later, or it's going to cost too much, are really hard. But again, I'm not going to march into a 6th grade class and talk about those things, but also the youth movement has been hugely inspiring, and they're terrified. And we're seeing mental health impacts in kids because of the planet they're inheriting. And they have a right to be really angry at us adults. So, like I said, I like to choose joy. I like to think about hope. I like to talk about solutions, but we've got a really serious problem in our hands, and the train hasn't left the station, but we're running out of time, and we need to start taking some big action soon. This is my personal view. Certainly everybody comes at this a little bit differently, but I just feel like I'm seeing the years tick by and reports come out and newspaper articles saying, we're breaking temperature records, and sometimes just pulling out my hair.
I can go next. So I'm going to take, I think, the opposite view, that it is not useful or productive to scare people, even though what we're going through is very scary. And like Kathy said, this stuff is very overwhelming. I've been doing this work for a long time, but I took my AP environmental science class in high school, and I think that's where my mind was like, oh my gosh, like we need to change things about the world. So, I've been thinking about these issues for a really long time, and it is my passion in life as well. But sometimes it's really very overwhelming, and sometimes I want to pull my hair out and walk away from my desk and not come back. But then who would that help? Then who would be working on these problems? And so even at a personal level, I have to look at this in a positive, holistic, yes, we can make a change way, or I don't think I would continue in this field because it's really overwhelming. Like Kathy said, it is the problem of our generation, the biggest challenge of our generation. And I think that change happens very slowly, which is unfortunate because we need to change quickly to address climate change, but we all know change happens slowly. And I think if we scare people, they are going to tune us out. And we really need people in this for the long haul, not just today or this month or this year, but for years to come. We need people doing what we said earlier, voting, volunteering, talking to people in their neighborhood, being on their planning boards, and we need to make a systematic change, I think, at the local level, but also globally. And I think I need inspiring stories. I need things that we can do to make change. And I think we need to bring people together in order to inspire change. Now, of course, there is a different way to look at it. We could say we need to scare people. We need to change much more quickly. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this question. But I will go on the side of it is not productive to scare people.
Deke, you're the tiebreaker.
Yeah, I'm right in the middle. It's a scary topic. I'm scared about climate change. Climate change, I deal mostly with the weather side of climate change. Climate change in the mid latitudes brings more rain in larger doses, and that makes flash floods. And flash floods are really good at killing poor kids, and that's scary. And like Kathy said, I would not go into a third grade class and say that. But like a lot of kind of larger issues that blanket across society, climate change is especially good at ruining poor people's lives and killing the most vulnerable. And that's not even getting into the environmental side. So it's a scary thing. But to kind of support what Sarah said, this is not fate, right? We're not damned to climate change. We are agents of change. That's why life exists. And I think helping people understand that their role, and ethnic extension is a great example of this, that their role as agents is just, you're wired, you've chosen a vocation, a profession where you wake up and help people. That's an amazing superpower. And that's the kind of people that we're going to need in dealing with climate change. And you probably don't wake up thinking, how can I solve climate change? But you're wired like, how can I help people? How can I help people in lasting pursuits, in work that defines their generations, their families? And climate change fits right in here. And I don't have time to go into the story, but I can tell you, I am a walking example of what happens when you invest. I'm from Oklahoma. My family's from Oklahoma. Oklahoma had a tough time in the 30s with climate. And because of the investments of people like you, I have a life that would not have seemed possible at the time. People, helped my grandparents make a farm and a farm economy work in a drought in the 50s. It was technically worse than the one in the 30s, and they made it through. And it's because good people from the community gave a damn and helped. And that's really where climate change communication really helps. And I think extension, and I was the best program structure in the world. Whoever was the University of Wisconsin in 1860, whatever, that came up with it was brilliant. You wake up and you help people, and then you see the results of that work evolve and develop and bear fruit over time. And that's the approach to climate change. You are way more empowered maybe than you realize, just by the disposition of your work to do that, to make those little changes that have ripple effects that grow over time.
Yeah, that was a really fantastic perspective. So I'm actually going to jump to a question that came in from Robin earlier, which I think was kind of getting at, how do you start the conversation around climate change? And I guess maybe even thinking, from the perspective of you're invited to give a talk specifically about it. How do you start that? Or even just, trying to strike up a conversation with a colleague or a neighbor and bringing in climate change. How do you do that?
Well, I can start. I always try to find something that we have in common first. So I gave a talk recently to our local power squadron, which is a boating group. And so, of course, I talked about how we love the water, and I showed, amazing photos, drone photos of, Eastern North Carolina with the beaches and the marshes, and, just talked about how we all have this value about being outside on the water and how we value these resources. And then later I went into the climate change, sea level rise, coastal resilience topic. So that's usually my go-to is what do we have in common?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes I recognize when I'm not the right messenger. Deke was talking about working with communities of faith. That's not necessarily my community, but I can point people to other resources. Or if we're talking about frontline communities and people of color, passing the mic to people who have those lived experiences, me not necessarily telling their story. And then I did an event with Protect Our Winters, which is a great organization of professional skiers and snowboarders and outdoor enthusiasts who care about climate change. And it was me, another scientist, and a skier having the conversation together. And it was just a great way to connect with that audience. I am not a professional skier by any means. I'm not even really a skier, but it was, it was a great pairing between science and the community.
Just echo Kathy's point. It's a great point, and something that we don't often say too loud is there are going to be situations where, just based on the way we are, one of us is just not going to be very good in a community or a setting, and recognizing that and finding someone that is going to succeed is a good skill to have. That's a really good point. Thanks for saying it out loud, Kathy.
Yeah, I want to echo that. I don't think we had said that yet, and I think that's really, really important, is to find somebody who is trusted in the community to be the messenger.
Thank you for those answers. So I think this will probably be our last question from Carl. Again, is thinking about mitigation and adaptation present different opportunities and challenges for communicators. And it might be tempting in North Carolina to leave climate change out of the room when talking about local impacts, because you just really need to address that problem in front of you. So do you believe that that's the best way to engage people right now? Or should we really connect these conversations to the bigger issues and make that clear?
I struggle with this myself, Carl. I tend to lean towards adaptation as kind of the default approach with folks, to a fault. And I think we can walk and chew gum, and kind of the best climate change communicators that I've been around are able to kind of get both sides of that equation. But it's a challenge. It's not an easy conversation to have where you're talking about kind of specific practices that can help you next month versus really big picture things that are usually wrapped up in policy rather than kind of local practice. It's a tough challenge, and I'll be the first to admit I tend to shy away from mitigation just because of the way I'm wired.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've started trying to think of examples that address both mitigation and adaptation at the same time. So for example, like a living shoreline, if you put in a living shoreline on your property, that can have adaptation, positive adaptation benefits. So, you're protecting your shoreline from rising sea levels or storm surge. But at the same time, living shorelines are made of natural elements, so they can store carbon underground. So it can be like a win-win. So often practices that help with adaptation can also help with mitigation. And so that's, if you can kind of think creatively about that, that might be a way, because I also struggle with this issue too. That might be something that you could communicate to people. Now, when you're telling people, I think mitigation is really hard on an individual level, because if we tell people, go turn your lights off, ride your bike to work, that's really great, but it's not going to solve the issue of climate change. We've seen during COVID that, we're not driving nearly as much as we did around the whole world, and we're still not changing our mitigation problems. So sometimes I feel funny asking people, I mean, with kids, it's really easy, right? You say, turn the lights off when you leave the room, ride your bike to school. But at the same time, I don't want to give them these things to do and say it's going to solve the problem when it's not. So it's sort of a fine line to walk, I think.
Yeah, and I guess I get the final word. First, this was such a joy. I've looked up to Deke for such a long time, so this was a great conversation. And Sarah, I'm so excited to work with you. I'm so excited to be here in North Carolina. And on that note, there was, when I took the job, a fair number of people who kind of approached me and told me what was expected of me as the North Carolina state climatologist, how I was to act, what I was to do, what I wasn't allowed to say. And back to what we were talking about at the beginning, I'm me. I'm showing up to this position as me. You get my whole self. I'm not for everybody, but I can say at the end of the day, I'm being truly authentic. And I talk about mitigation. I talk about the fact that we need to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. We know what we need to do. It's a big task, but again, we can do it. So, if people are going to take issue with me addressing the problem so directly, that's fine. Because like I said, truly staying true to myself and kind of crafting how I feel I should be filling the position. So, that's my advice to all of you. Just stay authentic, be yourselves, have real conversations, and don't be afraid to include yourself in it, because the storytelling or the personal anecdotes, your lived experiences with climate really do matter.
Those are such great notes to end on. That was perfect. Even if I had said, what's your closing message, you all already went for it. So I just wanted to thank everyone, all of our speakers today. Thank you so much for making this a true conversation. I learned so much from all of you. And thank you to everyone who was here today in the room, wanting to join this conversation. So I just wanted to, say thank you. This is recorded, so it will be posted on our website. We'll also upload a couple of related resources for discovering more information about communicating about climate change. We'll also try to continue this in the future. If there's interest in doing more dedicated training, having more time for conversations like this, we want to be able to create that space. So I'll end it there. I'll stick around for a moment or two if anybody has any follow-up questions or things they want to bring to my attention. But I just want to say thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for participating.
Hey, thanks a bunch. That was awesome. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Good to see you again. All right, Tom, I'd forgotten what you looked like.
Yeah, I know. Deke and I are supposed to be like near office mates if we ever actually get back into the office building. So, and I don't know, try to stay warm.
All right, you do. I'll see y'all. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Deke. Take care.